By the time Ruth Mercer was forced out of her rental outside Paducah, Kentucky, the lock had already been changed. Her coat was still hanging inside. At 73, she stood on that porch with one canvas bag at her feet and $5 folded inside an old pharmacy envelope. No savings, no room waiting for her anywhere. No rescue coming before nightfall. Just 5 $1 bills. And the kind of silence that tells you the world has already decided you are someone it can move past. Then, before the sun went down, Ruth did something no one watching her that morning would have believed. She spent her last $5 on a rusted shed. Not a house, not a trailer, not even a room. A shed. Leaning on a forgotten strip of land the county had priced like scrap. It should have been the final humiliation of her life. But the first time Ruth stepped inside, she did not find emptiness. She found order buried under dust, tools set aside too carefully, shelves arranged by a logic ruin had not erased. A workbench that looked less abandoned than interrupted, as if someone had stopped in the middle of something important and never came back. Subscribe now. Because what Ruth found in that shed did more than change her life. It exposed what this town had chosen not to see. By the time Ruth Mercer looked down at the key in her hand, it no longer belonged to anything. That was the first thought that landed clearly. Not the paper taped to the door, not the landlord's careful voice, not the heat pressing down over the little rental strip outside Paducah, just that key. Dull at the edges from years of use, suddenly turned into scrap between her fingers. The lock had already been changed. It gleamed in the morning sun with a brightness that felt almost insulting. New brass, smooth face, no hesitation in it. The old pale green door behind it looked exactly the same as it had the day before. But the life on the other side of it was no longer hers to enter. Ruth did not make a scene. She stood on the porch with one canvas bag at her feet and let the truth arrive in pieces. Her coat was still hanging on the hook behind the kitchen door. Her blue mug with the small crack near the handle was still beside the sink. Daniel's photograph was still on the short bookshelf near the window, the one she had dusted every Sunday without thinking. A whole life could remain in a room, while the person who built its routines was left outside, like an afterthought. The landlord had kept his tone even. That was the part she would remember later. No anger, no apology either. Just paperwork language in a human voice. Final notice period, non-payment, turnover. He had spoken as if he were describing a unit, not ending someone's last stable place in the world. A woman from 2 doors down lifted her blinds once. Her eyes met Ruth's for half a second, then vanished. That hurt more than Ruth expected. Not because she wanted rescue, she did not. Pride was still alive in her, even now. But there is something hard to swallow about being watched at the edge of humiliation, then quietly removed from sight, so everybody can go back to their morning. At her feet sat everything the day had left her with. A sweater too warm for June, a spare blouse, her reading glasses, a half-used bottle of aspirin, an old pharmacy envelope folded twice over. Inside it were 5 $1 bills. Ruth opened the envelope anyway, as if the number might change in the light. It did not. $5. That was what remained after 73 years of work no one had ever called work, after marriage, after widowhood, after stretching groceries, swallowing worry, patching clothes, paying what she could, delaying what she could not, and finding 100 invisible ways to keep other people from feeling how thin things had become. She looked once more at the door. The porch boards gave a dry creak beneath her shoes. A truck moved past on the road. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked, then stopped. The whole world had the nerve to sound ordinary. Ruth bent, lifted the canvas bag, and stepped off the porch without allowing herself to look back again. She still did not know where she would sleep that night, but before noon was over, she would see something tacked in the window of a feed store 3 towns away. And, by sunset, the last $5 to her name would belong to a rusted shed nobody else wanted. Ruth Mercer had not lost her footing in one grand disaster. It happened by inches, which was worse. People notice ruin when it arrives all at once. A fire, a funeral, a foreclosure truck, something loud enough to gather neighbors into the yard and make everyone speak in lowered voices. Ruth's life never gave anyone that kind of warning. After Daniel died, nothing collapsed in a way the world could point to. There was no headline day, just one missing paycheck, then one repair delayed, then one bill paid late and explained away. The damage came dressed as ordinary life. That was how it got so far. At first, she managed it the way she managed everything. She lowered the thermostat and wore socks to bed. She switched from brand-name medicine to whatever the pharmacist said was close enough. She moved a lamp from room to room at night instead of lighting the whole place. She stopped buying certain things before she ever admitted she had stopped. Fresh berries became bananas. Bananas became canned peaches. Canned peaches became whatever was cheapest and kept longest. The old sedan stayed parked more often. Trips were combined, then reduced, then quietly abandoned. The back tire kept losing air, and for 3 weeks she told herself it was better not to waste gas anyway. By then, Ruth had become very skilled at making less look intentional. That was one of the reasons no one understood how close she had drifted to the edge. Her daughter Elise loved her. Her son Travis loved her too, but both of them lived inside the kind of pressure that leaves little room for noticing subtler trouble. Rent, school pickups, shift changes, a grandson's speech appointments, a teenager's moods. Their calls were full of affection and full of motion. So Ruth made herself lighter to carry. "How are you doing, Mama?" "Oh, I'm all right." "You sure you don't need anything?" "No, honey, I'm just staying out of trouble." She learned to say it with a small laugh, the kind that closes a subject without sounding sad. She stopped mentioning the rent first. Then she stopped mentioning it at all. When the church brought over a casserole after she missed 2 Sundays, Ruth thanked them warmly and told them she had only been tired. She did not say she was stretching groceries. When Darlene offered her a ride to the pharmacy and the market in the same week, Ruth said yes to one and no to the other so it would not look like dependency was getting comfortable. That was the deeper truth of those years. It was not just poverty. It was self-erasure in polite clothing. She began trimming her own life down before anyone else had to. Old cardigans stayed in service long after the cuffs had gone shiny. Receipts were folded and refolded to keep track of what could wait. A cracked mug stayed in use because replacing it would have meant admitting how absurdly careful she had become about $10 and $15 decisions. And still, none of this felt dramatic enough to count as a crisis. That was how people vanished in plain sight. Not by being unloved, by becoming too disciplined with their struggle. By the final months, every envelope through the slot made her chest tighten before she even bent to pick it up. She could tell by weight which ones were ordinary and which ones meant trouble. The heavier notices came on stiffer paper. She hated herself for learning that. And when the last notice finally came, Ruth did not scream, or call anyone, or sit down on the kitchen floor and break apart the way younger people in movies always seem to do. She made tea. Then she stood at the counter holding the cup between both hands until it went cold. What frightened her most was not that she might lose the rental. It was how few people would understand what that really meant. By the time she stepped off that porch with $5 to her name, the day had already taken almost everything familiar from her. What she did not know yet was that before evening came, she would stop at a feed store west of town, glance toward a dusty window almost by accident, and see a handwritten county notice that made no sense at all. The feed store sat off a 2-lane road west of Paducah. The kind of place with seed catalogs on the counter, dusty fans turning overhead, and handwritten notices layered in the window until the older ones faded into the glass. Ruth had not gone there looking for a miracle. She had gone because she needed somewhere to stand for a few minutes without being watched too closely. Somewhere the day could settle around her before she decided what came next. Inside, a radio murmured low near the register. Someone at the back was asking about fencing wire. The smell of grain, motor oil, and old wood hung in the air. It was a working place. That helped. Working places asked less of a person emotionally. Ruth moved toward the front window without really meaning to. Her eyes passed over tractor parts, a flyer for a church fish fry, a handwritten ad for used tires, and then stopped. County surplus parcel minimum recovery, $5. She leaned closer. The notice was crooked, thumbtacked onto the board behind the glass. Most people would have skimmed past it. It described a narrow strip lot outside town limits, unimproved, unwanted, tax disposition. One outbuilding included, sale as is, no warranty, no assumed utility. And then there it was again, $5. Ruth read it twice, then a third time. Not because she thought she was mistaken, because the number felt almost obscene in its accuracy. All afternoon she had been trying not to think about how little of her life was still within her reach. And now, here was the county, calmly informing her that there was, in fact, one thing in the world she could still afford. A shed. She gave a short, breathless laugh before she could stop herself. It was not humor. It was insult, colliding with exhaustion. The clerk noticed her then, a heavy-set man with a sun-creased face and reading glasses low on his nose. He followed her gaze toward the notice and shrugged. "That thing?" he said. "Been sitting a while. Nobody wants it." Ruth turned slightly. "What kind of shed is it?" He lifted one shoulder. "Rusted one. Leaning some. Lots near worthless. Too narrow for much of anything. Near worthless." Ruth looked back at the paper. Maybe that should have ended it. Maybe a wiser person would have stepped away, kept the $5, and gone looking for something more sensible to do with them. But sensible had not opened a door for her that day. Sensible had not given her a bed for the night. And there was something almost unbearable about walking away from the only thing left in the world that matched what she had. By the time the clerk slid the county form across the counter, Ruth's hand was steadier than she felt. She signed her name once, then again where he pointed. And, just like that, before the sun had even started going down, Ruth Mercer became the owner of a rusted shed nobody else wanted. What she did not understand yet was why the thought of that place had already started pulling at her harder than common sense should have allowed. The parcel sat farther out than Ruth expected, past the cleaner roads, past the nicer mailboxes, past the places people still bothered to improve. By the time she found it, the light had started to thin. Evening had softened the edges of everything except the shed itself. That remained hard to look at. Rust streaked down the roof in long brown veins. One side leaned, just enough to make a person doubt the floor before stepping on it. Weeds crowded the steps. The windows were so clouded with dirt and age they looked blind. For a few seconds, Ruth simply stood there with the folded county paper in her hand. This was it. This was what her last $5 had bought. Not shelter, not comfort, not rescue. A structure people had passed often enough to forget it was there. The thought should have crushed her. Instead, it left her strangely still. Maybe because the day had already taken too much for disappointment to have much force left. Maybe because once life narrowed this far, even absurdity started to look practical. She climbed the short steps carefully. The boards answered with a dry groan but held. The padlock on the outer latch had long since rusted open. When Ruth pulled the door, it resisted at first, then gave with a rough scrape that sent dust lifting into the air. The smell hit her before the sight did. Old metal, dry wood, oil gone stale, mouse droppings, rain that had found its way in, then dried without being welcomed. It was the smell of time closing over a place and not being disturbed for years. At first glance, the inside looked exactly like what the county had claimed. Useless. Shelves bowed under cracked bins and coffee tins full of hardware. A warped table sat at the back wall. Loose boards leaned in a corner beside a broken stool. Cobwebs stretched from beam to beam in gray strands that caught the last of the light. But then Ruth took one step farther in, and something shifted. Not in the room. In her reading of it. The disorder was not complete. That was what bothered her. The front shelf was chaos, but the second had spacing. Not neatness exactly, more like intention that had been buried, not destroyed. On the back wall, 3 hand tools hung from nails at even distance, as if someone had put them back at the end of a workday and meant to return in the morning. Beneath the table sat a row of small wooden drawers, each with a metal pull and the faint shadow of old labels. Ruth moved closer. Dust had settled over everything equally. But the logic underneath it had not disappeared. This had not been emptied. It had been left mid-thought. She stood there, listening to the quiet inside the shed. And for the first time since the morning lockout, a different feeling pushed past the humiliation. Not hope, something sharper. The unmistakable sense that before this day was over, the shed was going to tell her something. Ruth did not go deeper into the shed all at once. She began the way older women begin most impossible things, by clearing one small space first. A cracked bucket near the door, a torn feed sack in the corner, a bent screen propped against the wall. She worked slowly, setting aside what looked useless and what looked uncertain into separate piles, not because she had a plan yet, but because making order was the only thing that steadied her. Dust rose with every movement. Her shoulders ached. Twice, she stopped to cough into the bend of her arm, but the more she cleared, the more the place resisted the county's lazy description of it. It was not junk. It was layered. The front section had been allowed to collapse into mess, but behind that mess, deeper in, things began to show themselves in categories. Hooks, fasteners, small brass fittings, boxed lamp parts, hinges wrapped in yellowed paper, jars of screws separated not by size alone, but by use, porch hardware in one place, cabinet catches in another, machine pieces she could not yet name, but knew had once belonged to something worth fixing. Ruth crouched near the row of small wooden drawers under the back table and pulled the first one open. Inside were tagged metal pieces, each wrapped in brittle paper and tied with string. She opened the second, then the third. The same care, the same logic. Not random storage, not the careless leftovers of a dead property. Whoever had worked here had known exactly where things belonged. Her hand rested on one drawer pull a second longer than necessary. That feeling again. Not memory fully formed, but the pressure of it. She turned toward the back shelf and found a ledger half hidden beneath a warped stack of invoices. The cover was stiff with age. Dust came off on her fingertips when she opened it. Inside, the writing was small and practical. Item names, quantities, road names, initials, delivery notes, short descriptions of repairs. Nothing sentimental, nothing decorative. A book written by someone who expected usefulness, not admiration. Ruth stood very still. Then she turned a page. And another. Somewhere under the fatigue, under the long, ugly day, under the shock of standing inside a shed she had bought with her last $5, something old in her mind began to move. At 19, before Daniel, before children, widowhood, and years spent stretching one thing into another, Ruth had worked for nearly a year in a repair shop owned by a cousin on her mother's side. It had been a narrow little place in southern Illinois, hot in summer, freezing in winter, with shelves that smelled of metal and cardboard and dust. She had never told that story much because it did not sound like much of a story. But she had been good there, quietly good, good at matching parts, good at reading supply lists, good at knowing that one broken piece almost always pointed to 3 more waiting to fail. She had not thought about that girl in years. Not because she had forgotten her exactly, because life had not left much use for her. Ruth lowered herself onto the broken stool and looked around the shed again. This time not as a stranded woman staring at ruin, but as someone beginning, unwillingly, to understand a language she had once spoken fluently. That was what changed in that moment. The shed did not become valuable. It became legible. And once that happened, Ruth saw something else tucked beneath the ledger at the back of the shelf. A stack of old customer slips, sorted by road name, not alphabetically, which meant the person who ran this place had not thought like a clerk. They had thought like someone who knew the area by memory. Ruth reached for the slips slowly, because now she had a new question. Not just what this place had been, but who had left it behind like this, and why nobody had ever come back for any of it. Ruth did not sleep in the shed that first night. She sat in her car until the sky went black, then drove to the far edge of a church parking lot and stayed there with the windows cracked, the ledger resting on the passenger seat beside her like something alive. She kept telling herself she would read a little, then stop, but each page pulled her farther in. The entries were plain, no flourish, no wasted language. Pump handle McCrae Road. Porch latch Blevins Farm. Sewing belt Harlan Place. Lamp collar 2 ordered, 1 held. Names, roads, parts, tiny notes in the margin, paid cash, deliver Friday, back shelf, ask about hinge pins. By midnight, Ruth understood 2 things. First, whoever had run the shed had known the county around it in intimate, practical detail, not as property lines or tax parcels, but as lived places with recurring needs. A porch that never held its latch, a gate that sagged every spring, a lamp that needed the same collar every few years because the wiring was old and nobody wanted the expense of replacing the whole fixture. Second, the problems listed in those ledgers had not disappeared, just because big stores had stopped caring about them. Old houses still stuck, old barns still leaned, old women still used sewing machines that had belonged to their mothers, men still patched instead of replaced when money got tight. The world had modernized on paper, but not evenly. Not out here. That thought stayed with Ruth into the next morning. By 10, she was back in the feed store, the ledger left carefully wrapped in her sweater on the passenger seat. She moved slowly through the aisles at first, pretending to compare prices on things she had no intention of buying. Then she waited until the counter was clear. The same clerk looked up. "You back about that parcel?" Ruth rested one hand lightly on the worn edge of the counter. "I wanted to ask you something else. Folks around here still come in looking for odd replacement parts?" He studied her for half a second. "Depends what kind. Old hardware, lamp pieces, gate latches, porch catches, small things nobody stocks much anymore." His mouth shifted, not quite into a smile. "More than you'd think." Ruth said nothing. That helped. People often gave more away when they were not rushed to fill silence. He scratched once at his chin. "Last month a man drove in from nearly 20 miles out looking for a pump handle fitment nobody had. Week before that, a woman wanted a treadle belt for an old sewing machine. You can order half this stuff online, sure, if you know what you're looking at. Most don't." Ruth felt her pulse move once. Hard. Not excitement exactly. Recognition. She thanked him and walked back outside into the heat, where the parking lot shimmered and a truck idled near the propane tank. For the first time since the eviction, the day no longer felt shapeless. It had edges now. Possibility too, though she was not yet ready to call it that. Back at the shed, she stood in the doorway and looked at it differently. Not as shelter. Not even as a lucky mistake. As a place that might still know how to be useful. Then her eyes fell on a row of tagged brass pieces near the back bench, and one road name on the nearest customer slip made her stop cold. She knew that road, and if the family still lived there, they might be the first people who could tell her what this shed used to be. The road name on the slip was Harlan Creek. Ruth stood with the paper in her hand for a long moment, staring at the faded ink as if it might rearrange itself into something safer. Harlan Creek was not some dead route from an old ledger. It was real. 12, maybe 14 minutes away if the side road was still passable. Daniel had once patched a roof out there years ago. She remembered the mailbox more than the house. Black post, silver numbers, always leaning slightly to the left. That memory unsettled her more than she expected, because it meant the ledger was not just old information. It belonged to a living map. By afternoon, Ruth had wrapped 3 small brass catches in a dish towel, slipped the customer slip into her bag, and driven out in a borrowed church sedan that coughed every time it climbed a hill. All the way there, she argued with herself. The family could be gone. The part might mean nothing. She might look like exactly what she feared most. An older woman reaching for relevance through somebody else's old records. But Harlan Creek was still there. So was the leaning mailbox. And, to Ruth's surprise, so was the house. It sat back from the road beneath 2 maples, with a porch rail that sagged at one corner and a screen door that failed to close flush. The yard was not neglected exactly, just managed by people who had learned to choose which problem mattered most each month. Ruth stayed in the car a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped out, straightened her cardigan, and walked to the porch with the wrapped brass catches held close against her side. A woman in her late 50s answered after the second knock. Wary face, dish towel over one shoulder, the kind of expression that did not waste trust on strangers. Ruth kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry to bother you. My name is Ruth Mercer. I came across an old repair slip with this road name on it, and I wondered if by any chance your porch latch still gives you trouble." The woman narrowed her eyes, then glanced toward the door behind her. "It sticks every time it rains," she said. "Has for years." Ruth unwrapped the brass pieces. Not dramatically, just carefully. The way a person handles something that was made to last longer than the people who first touched it. The woman looked down, then back up. "Where did you get those?" Ruth let her gaze drift past the woman's shoulder to the crooked catch plate fastened beside the screen frame. It was the exact size, the exact fit, and in that instant, Ruth felt something return to her so suddenly it almost frightened her. Not hope, certainty. Because if this first house still needed what the shed had been built to hold, then the shed had not died at all. It had only been waiting. And when Ruth finally answered the woman's question, the first real word of mouth from that old ledger was about to begin. The woman on Harlan Creek did not invite Ruth in. She did something more important. She opened the screen door wider, stepped aside, and let Ruth look at the latch. It was worn thin at the tongue, bent slightly from years of forcing it closed when the wood swelled in damp weather. Ruth did not need more than a few seconds. The brass catch from the shed was old, but cleanly made, better than most of what passed for replacement hardware now. She held it in place once, checked the alignment, then looked up. "This should work," she said. The woman folded her arms, still cautious. "You sure?" Ruth answered with the kind of quiet that carried more authority than a speech. "Yes." 20 minutes later, the screen door closed clean for the first time in years. The sound of it was small, almost ordinary. But the woman's face changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to say she had expected disappointment and received relief instead. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a few folded bills. Ruth almost told her no, not out of pride exactly, but because the moment felt too fragile to price. Then she caught herself. Refusing payment would turn usefulness into charity. She had not come there for charity. So she took the money. 3 bills, warm from the woman's pocket. The first money Ruth had earned from the shed. On the drive back, she kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly over her bag on the passenger seat, where the old customer slip and the remaining brass pieces lay wrapped together. It was still not enough to call anything a business. Barely enough to call it a beginning. But the whole day felt altered now, as if some hidden hinge inside her life had shifted and settled into a truer position. By the next afternoon, the change had already started moving beyond her. The woman on Harlan Creek had a sister. The sister had a neighbor with an old porch lamp no one had been able to fit properly since winter. By supper, a man at the feed store had asked the clerk whether the older woman who bought the county shed knew anything about gate hardware. He did not say Ruth's name, he did not know it, but he knew enough to ask. And that was all places like this ever needed. Not advertising, not a sign, just one solved problem carried into the next conversation. Ruth returned to the shed with a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, and a cheap notebook from a dollar shelf in town. She set the notebook on the workbench and wrote 3 headings across the first page. Still useful. Need to identify. Ask around. She stared at the words for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she began. A row of brass catches, 2 working hinges, 4 lamp collars, assorted screws, 1 small tin of sewing machine parts, 3 unknown fittings, with threaded ends. Everything she touched now felt different from the day before. Not valuable exactly. Valuable was too broad, too theatrical. These things were something better. Needed. Near dusk, A pickup slowed on the road outside the parcel. Not stopping, just slowing. Ruth looked up from the bench and watched it pass through the dirty window. Then, another half-hour later, she heard gravel shift under tires again. This time the truck paused longer. No knock came at the door. No voice called out. But by the time the sound faded and the road went quiet again, Ruth understood something she had not fully let herself admit before. The shed was no longer invisible. And once people started realizing it still held something useful, some of them were going to come looking for more than a porch latch. The first time someone came to the shed on purpose, Ruth almost pretended she was not there. It was just after 10 the next morning. She had been sorting through a coffee tin of mixed screws when she heard a truck door shut outside, followed by the sound of boots on the short wooden steps. Not hurried. Not hesitant either. The kind of walk that assumes the right to see what is behind a door. Ruth stood slowly, wiped her hands on her skirt, and waited. A man in his 60s appeared in the doorway wearing a faded cap and a look that tried to pass for casual. He glanced once around the shed, taking in the shelves, the open notebook, the small piles Ruth had arranged by type. "So it's true," he said. Ruth did not invite him in. "What's true?" He hooked a thumb toward the road. "That somebody's working out of this place again." Again. That word stayed between them for half a second. The man introduced himself as Owen McCrae from a farm several miles north. He asked if she knew anything about old pump fittings, then from his jacket pocket produced a metal collar chewed thin with age. Ruth took it, turned it once in her hand, and felt the shape of it answer somewhere in her mind, not certainty, but direction. "Maybe," she said. "Give me a minute." She moved to the back shelf, checked one bin, then another, then reached beneath the bench where she had stacked the sorted tins from the lower drawers. On the third try, she found a near match. Not identical. Close enough that with one washer adjustment, it would likely hold. When she handed it over, Owen let out a breath through his nose that sounded suspiciously like disbelief. "I've been trying to find one of these for 6 months." Ruth kept her voice even. "It's not exact, but it should do the job." He looked around again, this time with less curiosity and more calculation. "My daddy used to come here," he said, "long before the county got hold of it. Fella who ran the place could find near anything. Folks swore by him." Ruth felt her grip tighten around the edge of the workbench. "Who was he?" Owen frowned, as if reaching too far back at once. "Name's slipping me. Everybody just called him Mr. Vale, I think. Or maybe Vale. Something like that. Lived over in the old house that's gone now." He nodded toward the backside of the parcel. "Kept this shed going for years. Half the county patched their places through him. Half the county." After he left, the words would not leave her. Ruth sat down with the ledgers spread open and began reading differently. Not line by line now, but in patterns. Road names repeated. Family names repeated. Seasonal notations. Spring latches. Winter lamp collars, summer pump repairs, autumn hinge orders before cold weather stiffened old doors. This had not been one man tinkering in a shed for extra cash. It had been a quiet system, a practical lifeline, not for wealthy people, not for new construction, for older homes, working farms, rental places kept going on thin budgets. Women keeping inherited sewing machines alive because buying new was out of the question. Men nursing failing gates and porch rails one part at a time. The shed had served people whose lives, like Ruth's, depended on repair instead of replacement. That was the reframe. The county had sold her a worthless outbuilding. But this place had once been stitched into everyday survival all over the area. And then Ruth found the ledger that changed the feeling of the room. It was thinner than the others and tucked behind a warped board at the back of the lower shelf. Its entries were older, denser, less like transactions and more like tracking. Names. Owed balances. Notes about deliveries made after dark. Mentions of held items and set-aside stock for people whose accounts ran behind. A line beside one road name simply read, "Don't let bank men see the back inventory." Ruth read that twice, then again. A chill moved up her arms despite the heat. This shed had not just supplied old parts. At some point, it had protected people. Not in some grand heroic way. in the quiet rural way that mattered more. By extending time. By letting families patch one more season out of something the world had already given up on. By holding what they needed until they could pay. By keeping trouble from arriving all at once. That explained the tone in the margins. It explained the loyalty. It explained why a man like Owen McCrae still remembered this place with the kind of respect people do not waste on convenience. And it opened a much more dangerous question. If the shed had once mattered this much, why had it been allowed to vanish so completely from local memory? Ruth was still staring at that line about the bank men when she heard a vehicle slow outside again. Not like a customer this time. Slower, heavier. The engine idled for several long seconds without shutting off. And before Ruth even turned toward the dirty window, she knew with sudden certainty that whoever had just arrived was not here for a pump fitting. The engine stayed running. That was the first thing Ruth noticed. Not the truck itself. Not the shadow moving past the dirty pane. Just the steady idle outside the shed. Low, patient, deliberate. Whoever had pulled up did not come for a quick question or a porch latch. They had come expecting a conversation. Ruth closed the thin ledger and slid it beneath the folded dish towel near the back bench. Only then did she move toward the door. A dark pickup sat angled near the road, cleaner than most vehicles she had seen out this way. The man stepping out of it wore pressed jeans, polished boots, and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled just high enough to suggest he wanted to look practical without risking the trouble of actually being so. He was in his 50s, maybe younger if judged from a distance, older if judged from the eyes, the kind of man who smiled before deciding whether he meant it. He looked up at the shed. Then, at Ruth. "Afternoon," he said. Ruth rested one hand on the edge of the open door. "Afternoon." He took in the shelves behind her with a quick sweep that tried to seem casual and failed. "Name's Brent Coulter. Heard somebody finally bought this parcel." Ruth said nothing. That seemed to interest him. Brent nodded once toward the building. Didn't expect anyone to do much with it. Maybe that's why it was still there. A small pause followed. Not hostile, just measured. He gave a short smile. "Fair enough." Then he took 2 slow steps closer and lowered his voice into something friendlier, more confidential. "Truth is, I've had my eye on this strip for a while. Not for the shed. For the lot. Clean up the structure, maybe fold the parcel into a larger holding. But county nonsense takes county time." Ruth kept her face still. There it was. Not a customer, not a neighbor, not even simple curiosity. A man arriving too soon after word had started moving, and too smoothly for it to be coincidence. He glanced again toward the interior. "You planning to stay out here?" "For now." "In that condition?" "It's standing." Brent smiled again, but this time the expression looked more like patience than charm. "Mrs. Mercer, is it? Let me be direct. If you bought this as a temporary move, I'd be willing to save you some trouble. You made a clever pick. No shame in taking a quick profit." Ruth almost laughed. Quick profit. That was how men like him renamed desperation once they thought it might benefit them. "I only bought it yesterday," she said. "Exactly." He spread his hands. "So nothing's really rooted yet." Ruth let the silence sit between them a moment too long for comfort. Then she said, "You said you'd had your eye on it for a while. If that's true, why didn't you buy it?" For the first time, something shifted in his face. Not guilt. Irritation, maybe. Or surprise that she had stepped where he did not expect her to step. "I had other priorities," he said. Ruth nodded once. "I imagine you did." He tried another approach. "Look, I'm only saying this because I've dealt with county parcels before. They can come with complications. Access issues. Usage questions. Liability concerns. If anyone starts coming out here expecting service or repairs, places like this, they can get expensive in ways people don't foresee." That landed more sharply, because it was not a threat exactly. It was worse. It was the kind of warning designed to make an older person doubt their footing before they had fully planted it. Ruth looked at him for a long time. Then she answered in the calmest voice she had. "Interesting." He waited. She did not explain. A warm breeze moved through the doorway and stirred a loose invoice near the bench behind her. Brent's eyes flicked toward it, Too fast to hide, too interested to dismiss. Ruth saw it, and in that instant, the shape of the encounter clarified. He was not here because the parcel might become valuable someday. He was here because he had heard enough already to suspect it had once been valuable before, in a way he did not want rediscovered too publicly. "Do you know what this place used to be?" Ruth asked. Brent's answer came too quickly. No. It was a small word, clean, flat, but it missed the truth by half a second. That was all Ruth needed, because people lying casually usually fill the silence better than that. She gave a slight nod, as if satisfied, and watched him decide whether to stay or retreat. In the end, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, and held it toward her. "If you change your mind," he said, "call me before you get too invested." Ruth took the card. Not because she wanted it, because refusing it would have told him too much. He returned to the truck, backed out slowly, and drove off without waving. Ruth stood in the doorway until the dust settled. Then she looked down at the card in her hand. Brent Coulter. Property holdings. Paducah address. Clean print. Expensive stock. She turned it over once, and felt something cold settle into place inside her. This was no longer just about old parts and forgotten ledgers. Someone had known enough about this shed to want it before she ever stepped inside, and now that same someone was worried about what she might find next. Ruth did not call Brent Coulter. She placed his business card face down beneath the ledger on the back bench, then went right back to work. That was the first answer she gave him. Not with words, with refusal. The shed felt different after he left, smaller in one sense, because it was no longer hidden from the kind of people who watched land for a living, but stronger in another. His visit had confirmed what the ledger only hinted at. This place had not been forgotten by accident, not entirely. It had simply lain quiet long enough for men like Brent to mistake silence for surrender. Ruth was not ready to surrender anything. The next 2 days changed the rhythm of the shed. She stopped moving through it like a stranded woman making do. She began moving through it like a person with work to protect. The front shelf got cleared completely. The broken stool went outside. She washed the workbench with warm water and an old rag until the grain showed through beneath the grime. The notebook grew fuller. Brass catches, lamp collars, gate hardware, machine fittings. Ask Owen, check Harlan, hold aside, small instructions, small authority, her own handwriting slowly taking root in a place that had belonged to somebody else for years. That was when her son came. Travis had finished a night shift and driven in without warning, running on too little sleep and too much worry. Ruth saw his truck from the window and stepped outside before he could reach the door. For one brief second, she saw on his face what he had been afraid to say over the phone, not just concern, guilt. He looked at the shed, then at her. "Mama, you're really here." Ruth folded her arms lightly, more to steady herself than to defend anything. "I am." He walked the perimeter once, taking in the patched steps, the sorted piles near the wall, the notebook on the bench visible through the open door. "This isn't what I thought," he said. "No," Ruth answered, "it isn't." He stayed half the day, reinforced one corner of the door frame, cleared the brush back from the side wall, asked 3 times if she was sure she wanted to do this, though by the 3rd time the question sounded different, less like doubt, more like respect trying to catch up. Before he left, he stood by the truck with his hands on his hips and looked toward the shed again. "You've got that look," he said. Ruth frowned slightly. "What look?" "The one you used to get when something was broken and everybody else thought it was finished." That stayed with her long after he drove away, because it told her something she had not fully allowed herself to believe. Other people could see it now too, not the shed, her. That evening, Ruth carried Brent's card to the front shelf, held it over the open trash barrel outside, and let it go. Then she went back in, opened the thinner ledger again, and ran her finger down a column she had marked earlier. 3 names on the same road, 3 accounts noted as held, and, beside the last one, a penciled phrase so faint she had almost missed it before. "Ask Mrs. Vale before release." Ruth stared at it. Because until that moment, she had been looking for parts, patterns, and local memory. Now, for the first time, she had what sounded like an actual person. And if Mrs. Vale had anything to do with what this shed had protected, then Ruth had just found the next door she needed to open. Mrs. Vale was not a dead name in a ledger. She was a real woman, still living, still sharp, and, as Ruth would discover by the end of the next day, still carrying the last unspoken part of the shed's story. It took time to find her. No one at the feed store knew for sure where she had gone. Owen McCrae only remembered that after the old house behind the parcel came down, the Vale woman had gone across the river to stay with family. It was Darlene from church, through 2 cousins and 1 long phone call, who finally gave Ruth an address in Metropolis, Illinois. The woman who opened that door was in her 80s, wrapped in a light cardigan despite the warmth, with silver hair pinned neatly back and eyes so alert they made the years around them seem almost beside the point. "Mrs. Vale?" Ruth asked. The woman studied her face for 1 long second, then glanced at the folded ledger under Ruth's arm. "Yes," she said quietly. "You came from the shed." Not a question. By the time they were seated in the small front room, Ruth understood that Lenora Vale had been waiting a long time for someone to ask the right questions. When Ruth told her about the county sale, about the ledgers, about the customers beginning to return, Lenora closed her eyes briefly and let out a breath that sounded less like surprise than recognition. "So it wasn't lost after all," she said. Ruth sat forward. "What was it really?" Lenora's hands rested on the blanket in her lap, thin and still. But her voice never wandered. Her husband, Martin Vale, had built the shed into something far more useful than it looked from the road. He stocked the old parts nobody else bothered to carry anymore. Porch catches, pump pieces, lamp collars, window latches, sewing belts, gate hardware. The little things that kept ordinary homes and farms functioning when money was too tight for replacement and too tired for pride. But the shed had done more than sell parts. It had bought people time. If someone could not pay that week, Martin held the item. If a widow needed a porch fixed before winter, he made sure the latch found its way to her. If a farm family was 1 broken pump away from real trouble, he found a way to keep the repair off the books until they caught up. Quiet help. Practical help. The kind that lets people hold on without having to kneel for it. That was what Ruth had been feeling all along without yet having words for it. The shed had never been about inventory. It had been about endurance. Lenora looked at Ruth for a long moment. "After Martin died, I tried to keep a little of it going. Not all. Just enough. But my hands gave out. The county circled. People said the parcel wasn't worth the fight." A faint hardness entered her voice. "That usually means it was worth something to the wrong people." Ruth felt that settle deep. Not because it was dramatic, because it explained everything. The neglected sale, Brent Coulter's sudden interest, the tone in the thinner ledger, the line about not letting bankmen see the back inventory. The shed had not been ignored because it meant nothing. It had been allowed to disappear because the kind of usefulness it carried did not count for much to people who measured value from a distance. When Ruth rose to leave, Lenora touched the ledger once with the tips of her fingers. "He always said that shed only looked small from the road," she murmured. Then she looked up. So did people. The drive back to Kentucky felt different from every drive Ruth had taken since the eviction. For the first time, she was not surviving a mystery. She was carrying an inheritance of purpose. What followed was not magic. That mattered. The shed did not suddenly become beautiful. Ruth did not become rich overnight. The roof still leaked near the back corner when the rain came in hard. Some weeks, the money stayed modest enough to keep her careful. But something had shifted beyond argument. The place had a name again in people's mouths. And then, slowly, so did she. More customers came, a church custodian needing an old lamp fitting, a landlord trying to keep 3 rentals functional without replacing every fixture in them, a woman from Calvert City looking for a sewing machine belt that matched one her mother had used for years. Ruth solved what she could, logged what she could not, held things aside, asked questions, learned the old shelves until her hands could go to the right drawer faster than thought. The notebook thickened. So did her place in the world. Travis came back and fixed the doorframe properly. Elise mailed index cards, markers, and 2 battery lanterns. Owen McCrae sent a neighbor. The neighbor sent a cousin. By early autumn, people no longer spoke of the parcel as that rusted county shed outside town. They called it Ruth's place. That mattered more than money ever could have on its own. Because being named correctly is a kind of restoration. Even Brent Coulter understood that by the time he returned, he pulled up one afternoon in the same polished truck, but this time there were already cars along the roadside. A man waiting on a hinge set, a woman picking up a lamp collar, a younger couple asking Ruth to look at an old window catch. Brent stood outside the door long enough to see what the shed had become, not profitable in the flashy way he respected, but useful in the way that makes profit-seeking men arrive too late. "I see you've gotten settled," he said. Ruth looked past him at the road, then back at his face. "It's in use," she replied. Nothing more. She did not need more, because he could see it for himself. The sorted shelves, the open notebook, the waiting people. The fact that the structure he had once hoped to fold into a holding was now attached to someone in a way paper alone could not capture. He did not mention buying it again. He left with his hands empty. By the time cold weather began pressing into western Kentucky, Ruth no longer stood in the shed as someone who had ended up there by humiliation. She stood there as the person people came to when something old, worn, or nearly discarded still needed one more chance to hold. And maybe that was the deepest truth the story had been circling from the beginning. What the town misjudged was never just the shed. It was the kind of value that does not shout, does not advertise, does not look impressive from the road, but keeps people going, all the same. The county had priced that place at $5. The town had nearly priced Ruth the same way. They were wrong about both. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories like Ruth's. Like this video if you believe dignity should never be priced so low. And tell me in the comments, what do you think mattered more in the end? What Ruth found inside that shed, or what the shed helped her find inside herself?